"Go to sleep now, Oren," I murmured, pulling the thin blanket over his small shoulders. He was restless again, his eyes stubbornly staying open, fixed on some invisible point on the dark ceiling. Patience, I admit, had abandoned me long ago that night. That's when the words slipped out, almost of their own accord. A fragment of some stupid story I'd heard once, a local legend about something that hid in the shadows. Go to sleep now, or the Unmaker will come to erase you from the dark corners. The sentence hung in the heavy air of the room. I didn't believe it, of course. It was just a tool, a lever to push my stubborn son toward sleep. But Oren flinched instantly, his wide eyes now focused on me, then darting to the darkest corners of the room. It worked, I thought with a sigh of guilty relief. He finally closed his eyes, clutching the edge of the blanket tightly. The next morning, the smell of stale coffee hung in the kitchen as I tried to make something edible out of eggs. Oren was in his high chair, swinging short legs that barely reached the floor. His silence was unusual. Then he looked up, his eyes too serious for his age. "Dad," he began, his voice hesitant. "What does he look like? The Unmaker?" A chill ran down my spine, a stupid premonition. I forced a smile. "He's nothing, champ," I replied, flipping the eggs with a too loud sizzle in the pan. "It's just a silly story, the kind grandparents tell to scare kids. He's not real." I served the eggs onto his plate, the pale yellow looking sickly under the kitchen's dim light. I kissed the top of his head, feeling the almost unreal softness of his fine hair. He didn't seem convinced, but he started eating in silence. I turned back to the stove, trying to ignore the cold feeling his question had left in me. I thought that would be the end of it. What a terrible mistake. I had no idea what I had invited into our home, into our lives. I didn't know that sometimes the stories we tell have the power to materialize from the shadows we try to ignore. Weeks passed. Life tried to return to normal, but something had broken that night. I became more watchful, jumpier, and then it happened. It was late at night, the house groaning under the weight of silence. I went to check on Oren, a ritual that now felt more like a compulsive need than fatherly care. I opened the door slowly, the dim light from the hallway spilling into the room. And there it was, crouched in the darkest corner, near the window with its thin curtains, was something. It wasn't a man, not an animal. It was a ripple in the darkness, a vaguely humanoid shape composed of shimmering shadows and motes of dust that constantly danced and disintegrated as if struggling to hold its form. It had no face, just a void where one should be. And the cold. It was unlike any cold I'd ever felt. An absence of heat, of life, that seemed to suck the energy from the very air, leaving an icy vacuum in its wake. I froze, blood roaring in my ears. The scream I wanted to let out died in my throat, turning into a silent gasp. My legs felt like lead. Then, my eyes fixed on Oren, sleeping peacefully in his bed, just feet away from that thing. Fatherly instinct, sheer panic, finally, broke through my paralysis. With a guttural roar, I burst into the room. The shadow figure seemed to hesitate, its unstable head turning towards me. But before I could take more than 2 steps, it dissolved. There was no sound, just a silent implosion of darkness and dust that flowed into the shadows under the bed, through the cracks in the floorboards, vanishing as if it had never been there. I grabbed Oren, shaking him awake. He opened his eyes, startled, but strangely, he didn't cry. He just looked at me, then at the empty corner. with a stillness that was more disturbing than any tears would have been. The police came, of course, lights flashing in the dark street, curious neighbors peeking through windows. They were polite, but skeptical. "A break-in, Mr. Silas?" Orrin, wrapped in a blanket on my lap, just whispered, "Dark someone," when asked. What could I say? That I saw an entity made of shadows and emptiness in my son's room? Pressed, with their patient but probing looks fixed on me, I lied again. "A burglar," I stammered. Orrin saw someone in a dark mask. The bitter taste of the lie was almost unbearable. They took notes, promised extra patrols, and left, leaving me alone with my fear and my guilt. We stayed in a motel for a few days. The smell of stale cigarettes and cheap cleaning products couldn't mask the stench of my fear. I could barely close my eyes. Orrin, however, slept deeply, a heavy, dreamless sleep, almost inert. When we returned, I turned the house into a fortress. New locks, bars on Orrin's bedroom window, even a cheap camera in the hallway streaming to my phone. But none of it helped. The feeling of being watched persisted. And Orrin? Orrin began to disappear. Not literally at first, but his voice, already quiet, became an almost inaudible whisper, like the brushing of moth wings. He stopped playing with his blocks, his cars. He would spend hours sitting on the sofa, staring at the wall or at nothing. And then I started noticing the visual things. A glimpse in the bathroom mirror. He looked translucent, like frosted glass. His reflection in the window on rainy days seemed to fade at the edges. I'd blink, and he'd be solid again. Was I going crazy? I took him to more doctors. Tests? Questions? Nothing. "It's the trauma, Mr. Silas," they'd say with professional sympathy. Give him time. But time only seemed to make things worse. Orrin's stillness deepened. And then, the most bizarre discovery. He no longer left clear fingerprints. I had him hold a clean glass. Nothing. Just a vague smudge. His drawings on the fogged-up windowpane vanished in seconds, while mine remained. I started to feel like a character in a cheap horror story, rationalizing the impossible. "It's his skin oils," I told myself. "The glass is too cold." Lies. Desperate lies. My own sanity began to fray. The whispers in the walls became more frequent, sometimes almost forming words I couldn't quite grasp, sometimes sounding like distorted echoes of Orrin's name. I felt inexplicable cold drafts, even in closed rooms, and the sensation seemed concentrated towards the attic. That slightly ajar door became the focus of my paranoia. I climbed the creaking stairs several times a day, then at night, heart pounding, flashlight trembling in my hand. The attic was always empty, except for old boxes, cobwebs, and the smell of dust and time. But I felt something there. A weight. A waiting. On one particularly bad night, after hours of listening to the whispers and feeling the cold emanating from the ceiling, I called my mother. I needed an anchor. The line was worse than ever, full of static and cutting out. "Mom," I started, trying to keep my voice steady, "things have been difficult." As she began to reply, the whispers on my line intensified, a ghostly chorus beneath her voice. "Mom," I interrupted, panic rising. "Is someone else there? On the line?" Her confused reply was muffled by a distinct sound, a sharp, quick gasp. Right next to my ear. It wasn't coming from the phone. I dropped the handset with a clatter. The sound had come from the hallway. I ran, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would explode. The attic door was wide open, and in the darkness just below it, crouched like a predator, was the unstable shape of shadow and dust, swaying gently, waiting. The figure rose, or rather, elongated, the shadows writhing. The cold intensified, making the air hard to breathe. And then, the voice, Oran's phantom whisper, but empty, inflectionless, emanating from that formless absence. "Hello, Dad." I wanted to run, but I was rooted to the spot. The entity, or the voice, began its psychological torture. What smell did he love most, Silas? The smell of rain on the earth after a storm? How did it know that? What was the first secret he told you? The one about the bird with the broken wing he tried to hide in the closet? Memories I could barely access now were thrown in my face by this thing. Does he really remember his grandmother's face, Silas? Or do you just think he remembers because you showed him the pictures so many times? Each question was an icy needle in my mind, undoing my own memories, my own certainty. "Shut up!" my shout echoed down the silent hallway. "Stop it! What do you want? Give me back my son. Give him back." The whisper turned into something that might have been laughter, a dry, mirthless sound, like dust being swept in a tomb. But I am part of him, Silas. Or perhaps he was always part of me. You felt incomplete. Your desire for a son was an open wound, bleeding into the darkness. You wanted one so badly, but perhaps not exactly as he was. Perhaps more. Malleable, the voice insinuated, twisting a knife in my secret guilt. I merely filled the void you left, built something from myself, an echo of your desire. But it was a lone Silas, a fragile draft. I warned you, in the subtext of your own stories, that it wouldn't last. Now, I need the parts back. I need to remake myself. The others? The doctors? Your mother? The police? They won't remember this vibrant Oran you tried so desperately to keep. They'll only remember the whisper, the blur, what I allowed, just like you. As the last words echoed in my head, I felt movement in my arms. I looked down, horrified. Oran was coming undone, literally. His skin lost its color, turning gray and then transparent. His fine hair loosened and turned to dust in the air. His hands and feet receded into his clothes, not as if shrinking, but as if the substance composing them was being sucked back somewhere, disintegrating into nothing. I held him tighter, but it was like trying to hold smoke. His form flickered, dissolved, and then nothing. Just the small, now strangely colorless clothes, falling empty to the floor at my feet. They too began to look old, worn, as if forgotten for decades in an instant. I sank to my knees beside them, the sound of my own sobs echoing in the terribly silent hallway. The following days were a waking nightmare. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The whispers had stopped. The cold drafts vanished. But Oran's presence was disappearing too, in subtle, cruel ways. The drawings he'd taped to the fridge faded until they were indistinct smudges. His favorite toys, left on the living room floor, seemed to gather a thick layer of dust that, when I tried to wipe it away, caused the plastic or wood to crumble in my hands. The photos in the frames were blank or showed only me, alone. It was as if the house itself was actively forgetting he had ever existed. Then, one morning, I got up mechanically, moved by broken habit, and headed towards Oren's room. I stopped abruptly in the hallway. Where his bedroom door should have been, there was only the continuous, unmarked surface of the plaster wall. No frame, no doorknob, not the slightest indication that a room or a son had ever existed there. I sat down on the cold hallway floor, my back against the opposite wall, staring at that smooth, featureless space. The emptiness in the house was now absolute, a perfect reflection of the crater that had opened inside me. I wasn't crying anymore. I was beyond that. I looked at the wall and whispered to the still air, to the entity I could still sense, a cold, observing presence in the shadows of my own mind. Why? Why do this? The answer came not as sound, but as an icy thought, implanted directly into my consciousness, clear and cruel. It was a lesson, Silas, about desire, about the voids you humans create and try to fill. I learned so much observing you, your longing, your imperfect love, your fear. It was instructive. A final spark of defiance rose in me. Will I remember him, even if no one else does? There was a pause, a sense of cold amusement. Fragments, came the final reply. Echoes in your empty mind. Whispers only you will hear. Enough for you to always know what you lost. The void you helped create, and which now belongs to me, now that I am whole again. And then silence. Absolute. I stayed there, staring at the wall. A broken man in an empty house, haunted not by a ghost, but by the absence of a son who perhaps had only ever existed in my desperate desire. Linnea visits sometimes. I see the worry in her eyes. She's kind, patient, but she doesn't understand. How could she? She told me, with that gentle caution she uses when walking on eggshells around me, about our first conversation over a year ago, how I'd told her, with a conviction that now haunts me, that I'd never been married, never had children. But there was a pain in you, Silas, she said softly one day, holding my hand that wouldn't stop trembling. A longing, like you'd lost something immense, or never had it. She said she recognized that look. She knew loss, too. Now, she worries about my habits, the way my eyes drift, fixing on empty spots on the wall for minutes at a time. The insomnia that has carved dark grooves beneath my eyes. And the whispers. She swears she sometimes hears me whispering softly when I think I'm alone, talking to the shadows. Oren. Was he real? Was it him I saw unravel in my arms? Or just the final illusion shattering? The Unmaker said the others would forget him. Said I would forget. Except for fragments. Echoes. Sometimes I look at the smooth wall where the door should be. Sometimes I think I hear a child's whisper from the attic. Sometimes I feel an inexplicable chill. And I wonder if the Unmaker is still here, learning, watching, waiting for another desperate wish to create a new void for it to fill. And I no longer know what's real.